Many of your sources come from the Works Progress Administration interviews with formerly enslaved people or people who somehow remember the slave system. Talk to us a little bit about these kinds of sources. First, tell us how these documents got created, and then let's talk about how they were used.
Okay, so the narratives of our interviews were taken during the Great Depression, at the time when the federal government was trying to find various ways to put people to work. And so one of the projects it came up with was to interview former slaves. And so people were hired. Some of them had some experience with writing, and but others did not, and they were hired to just travel throughout the South and take interview.
They were paid to do this.
They were paid to do this as part of the, like if you were in the CCC or any other federal project where people were put to work, so they were paid to do this, yes.
And how did they find former slaves?
Well, they had a set of questions that they were given from headquarters, one might say, and they found many of them through word of mouth. And so this gets to a potential problem, right? Because some of the people who were hired were locals. So if you were a former slave, you might be interviewed by the granddaughter, great-granddaughter of the person who owned you. And so people would say, well, Bob lives, down this road and down that road, and I think he's still alive. You might try that, and you might get there. And Bob might say, well, Sue is across the road. So it was a haphazard kind of endeavor in that respect. Unless you went to a town or a city like Nashville or Mobile, where you could easily get to a black community and find people.
What's confusing about this is the question of how a historian uses or thinks about these haphazard materials. After all, these are memories of people who are probably in their 70s and older. They're memories. They've never been written down before because it's not as though most people kept journals, and they're haphazardly collected. How does a historian think about this rather large body of material?
Someone who's used them, I have found them to be incredibly important and useful. And I've had to think about these questions about what do you do with a document that it's an interview taken from somebody who was 70 years old in 1936 or 60, whatever. What do they remember? What could they have known? And so two things. One is that many of these people were children when slavery ended, but they don't rely on their memory of slavery. What they say over and over in document, interview after interview, is, my mother told me this story, or my grandmother told me this story, and I remember, or she remembered, when Lisa and her husband were hanged by the old peach tree because they killed their master because their master had sold Lisa's child. And when Lisa cried, the owner said, oh, don't worry about it. You can have another child as easily as I can buy a dog or something like that. So he made light of it, and so Lisa and her husband killed him. And that the person who relates this story didn't witness the hanging of Lisa and her husband, but carried that story down as a memory. And so we can talk a bit in a minute about memory as a problem. So that's one part of it. And the other part that makes these memories so critically important is that people don't try to give themselves, on the one, they don't try to give themselves credit for what they didn't see, and two, what they did see, they remember so vividly. A child who saw a mother sold or a sibling sold, that's a kind of memory that you're more likely to carry than remembering the day on which somebody was baptized, right? Or somebody was married. But I also find it remarkable that people can remember even those kinds of details. So I don't find them to be a problematic source when I take into consideration not only the provenance, but also the content and the context. And no more problematic, than my relying on a mistress's diary that was written in 1861, and then she recreated it in 1890, or maybe even in 1920 to make it more sort of friendly to the market, where now she's going to publish it. Every historical document requires that we look closely and that it bears some connection or resemblance to something that is another part of the story. So if slaves are talking about, and going back to the question of violence, about violent mistresses, and all I have is slaves talking about it, then I would be a bit cautious about how I use that. But if I have them talking about it and the mistress is also talking about it, then that, it confirms that, okay, these people aren't just making up things out of thin air. It is true that our memories, our minds, our ability to remember diminish over time. But what they remember is so supported by every other kind of source that we have. And I think traumatic events find a place in memory that other events don't. There's the other part of that trauma can make you forget. It can be so dramatic that you want to push it back, and your body helps you to do that so that you don't dwell in. But trauma can also be such that you can't put it aside, or you can't remember. And I think it's problematic when historians say, well, Black people didn't remember even the Civil War. Yeah, they did, and just because nobody goes to ask you what it was. Nobody went to ask them in 1900, and they only went in 1930, and by then a lot has happened in the middle of a depression. So some person interviewed might say, things are really hard now, and the impression a historian might get as well, they think that slavery was better. No, things are hard now. They're hard because there are no jobs, because the Agricultural Adjustment Administration has, a policy that says that we'll get nothing, but the landowner will get, something, because none of the federal agencies have Black women domestic workers are not, embodied in this, sort of new idea about what America could be. So all of that is the context, right, for thinking about the slave narratives. And as I work on this project on refugees, I'm increasingly engaged with refugees in other countries, refugees from other wars, and memory, and what people repress, and why at certain moments are they ready to give that information up. And you could see it with the Jewish refugees, a lot of information repressed for a long time. Then a moment comes, for lots of different reasons, that people are talking about what that meant. And I think that literature and that experience can tell us a lot about these ex-slaves and
So the 1930s was a moment, you
A
think,
moment.
when there was both the opportunity and the contextual, the difficulties of the
And
Great
people
Depression
are
made
dying,
it possible
and do you want to die with these memories?
Right.
And nobody's saying, this way, but in your own mind,
Right.
So yeah.